Hi everyone, this is Desiree again. Welcome to the studio. Today we're going to talk about reworking clay, or reclaiming clay as some of you might call it, and we're going to look at 3 ways of doing this. A little known factoid about myself is that I am in fact the queen of reworking clay, and if you come with me I'll show you why. So as some of you would know, I inherited this studio from my father. And I have bags and bags of rock hard clay that needs to be reworked. I'll start at the studio door. Here you can see some of them. Go a little deeper inside. Some more bags of clay. Can you see them right in there? So I've reworked most of what's in this crate, but there are still some surprises. Something like this, a very hard ball of clay that I have no idea what it is or what it will look like once it's fired. So as we move on through the studio, there's another table with bags of clay under it. As you can see, quite a few here as well. And then if I move even further, right in the corner, I have another stash. I also have a few buckets full of hard clay, like this one. Here at least I know what clay it is because it's got a name on the bucket. And then to top it all off, I have these big dustbins full of clay. That's also hard, and that's been hard for decades. So that's my work cut out for me. I've already reworked a lot of the clay in the studio, but as you can see, there's still a lot more to go. Okay, so the first method I'm going to show you for reworking clay is when you have a solid piece of clay, like this ball of clay that I took out of the crate I showed you just now, that needs to be reworked. And for that, let me just adjust the camera a bit. For that, we're going to use just a plastic bag with a zip. Going to pop the clay in there. I'm going to add some water, and this is just some to start with. I don't know how much water will really be needed to rehydrate this ball of clay. I'm just going to add a little bit more. Yeah, we'll see. Going to try to push out as much of the air as I possibly can. And then just close up the zip. There we go. I've just found that the bags with the zip locks are much easier to work with than a bag that you have to actually tie or close in another way. So there we go. They are remarkably watertight. You can actually turn them upside down and the water won't come out. Okay, so once you have this clay in the bag with the water, you submerge it into a bigger container with water in it. And the water in that container will keep always pushing the water towards the clay so that all of your clay comes into contact with the water. And I'll go show you that quickly. So this is the basin in which I put my bags of clay and water. I don't care that the water is so dirty around it. It doesn't get into contact with the clay ever. And I leave it here for a long time. I do check it from time to time, and sometimes, like I think here for instance, there will be a bag of clay that's still quite hard, and I will add some water to it if necessary. So for now, we're just going to take the bag that we've prepared now and just wedge it in there as deep as possible so that it's covered with the water. And I will come check on that also in a couple of days' time. The second method I have for reworking clay is when I have dry clay, like shavings from trimming pots or pots that flopped, like in this bucket. Oopsie, there's a spider. Could you please leave, Mr. Spider? Thank you. And what I would do in this case is I would smash up the clay using this thing. I'm not sure what you call it. Anyway, I would keep going till the particles are quite small, and then I would actually empty this out into another bucket, fill this bucket with water, and throw the fine pieces of clay back in. And you can roughly use water up to the level that the clay pieces were. So if this is where the clay pieces come to in this bucket, that's how much water I would put in. And then the trick is to put the clay pieces in after the water, because that makes sure that all the clay gets wet. So next to it I have a bucket of white rework that I've had in there for a couple of days. So this was also clay that I smashed into little pieces and then added to a bucket of water. So I'll show you next what we do with that to turn that mush into clay. Okay, so for this next step of reworking my clay, I would usually wear gloves. I don't usually wear gloves when I do pottery because I believe that you should feel the clay. But for this exercise, I would really advise that you wear gloves. So what I have is a plaster of Paris bat. So I have this thick plaster of Paris bat. One side of it I use when I rework white clay, and the other side of it I use when I rework any brown colored clay. This works very, very well, but as an alternative you can use something like a ceiling board or a piece of drywall, and you can even do it on a wooden table or a piece of wood, although that's generally not as effective at extracting the moisture from the reworked clay, which is what you want. So I have my clay. I also have a utensil that I got from the kitchen. I'm frequently in trouble for using kitchen utensils in the studio, but anyway, this works very well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to scoop out this clay onto the bat. Bit by gloopy bit. Okay, I still have quite a bit of clay left in my bucket, but this is as much as I can fit on here for now, so I'm just going to stop there for now. Just leave that for a while, and then I will let this set up and dry until I can lift it off the bat, and I'll show you what that looks like when we get to that point. Okay, so while we're waiting for the clay from the bucket to get a little more firm, I am going to work on one of the bags of clay that I've added water to quite some time ago, and I'm just going to get that out of the bag onto my bat. Okay, so what I have is I have pieces of clay that's very soft and other pieces of clay that the water hasn't really managed to penetrate. So this is hard work, but it's the only way to do it, is to try and break up those little hard pieces. Because sometimes with this very old clay, it's just so dense and so hard that the water just does not go in there, no matter how long you leave it. So it almost becomes like hard pieces with slimy pieces around it. This is really hard. I think I'm going to get a tool to help me. So this is just a paint scraper that I use to cut through the hard pieces of clay, break them up a bit, makes it much easier. Just be careful when you do this, if you are working on a plaster bat, not to damage your bat, because it could easily happen. So when you rework clay, moving it about is a very important thing, because it is moving the clay, tearing it apart, bringing it back together, that actually homogenizes it. So it ensures that all the clay is equally hydrated. With clay like this, that's very old and has been extremely dehydrated, it's not as simple as just taking it out of the bag and it's all one lovely piece of clay, one consistency again. It is going to be lumpy, and working through those lumps is hard work, but it is ultimately worth it. You'll see that I now have it at a point where it's beginning to lift off the bat. The clay's lifting off the bat, it's not sticking so much anymore. Bat's broken, but it still does the job. So I'll just keep doing that until I have all the mess off my bat, and then we'll go to the next step. I'm shaking things around now because this clay is very hard. And my poor plaster bat has seen better days. This bat is almost as old as I am, which is 50. So I think it's sort of done its bit in the studio. It's time for it to be replaced. So this has come a long way from the lumpy mess that we took out of the bag, and it's now ready to be worked with. Okay, so I promised you 3 different ways of reworking clay. So the last way we have is when you have clay that's quite hard but not dry yet. So these would be trimmings that you just got off from a leather hard pot, or it might be a pot that you set up to dry to leather hard, but now you see it's warped or there's something wrong with it, so you can't use it anymore. So to rework that clay, what you do is you squash that hard clay into a ball as much as you can, and then when you've done that, you take your cutting wire, mine is just fishing line and 2 pottery beads, and you cut through the clay so that you have these slices. And then you take a spray bottle and you spray them. When you've given them a good spray, you can just stack them back together. Doesn't have to be in the same order. And then this new brick of clay, you set upright again, and now you're cutting it the other way into slices. And now you can rotate it yet another way, and you just continue the process. So every now and again you can check whether your clay is of such a consistency that you can begin to wedge it. This is still quite hard. Oopsie. Just got another crack in my bat. Okay, so that means we've got to do this thing again a few times. It's not an exact science, so you just keep going until the clay is the consistency you want it to be, where it's really workable, where you can wedge it, where it will be soft enough to use on the wheel or for any slab building projects that you might have. You just keep at it. It is a time-consuming process, but if you are like me and just can't stand the thought of throwing away a ball of clay just because it got hard, then you just put in the effort and you just do it. So a question that people sometimes ask is whether you can mix different kinds of clay when you rework them. So as a general rule, I do mix clays. I mix brown clays and I mix white or grey clays. So I haven't yet mixed the white clays with the brown. But what is very important when you do rework clays and want to mix clays for any other purpose is that you never mix stoneware and earthenware clays, because the slumping temperature for earthenware is much lower than for stoneware, and if you mix the two, you might find your pots slumping if you take them to stoneware temperatures. It won't be such an issue if you mix stoneware and earthenware and you just take them to an earthenware temperature. That'll be okay. But yeah, not the other way around. Okay, so I don't know about you, but this is beginning to look like a decent piece of clay to me. I'm just going to wedge it a little more and then cut it through so that we can see what it looks like. Cutting it through the middle, opening it up. It is lovely, it is smooth, it is without air bubbles. This is now clay that can be used to make something pretty. So we'll put that away and then we'll get back to this white clay over here. Okay, so the clay from our bucket has now been on the slab for several hours and it is time to get down and dirty with it. Let me show you how. Okay, so what is marvelous about these plaster bats is that they absorb the water from the clay. And after a while, several hours mostly, depending on how wet your clay was, you can literally lift it off the bat and it all comes together. So it's not as messy and slimy as it used to be. It actually becomes a lovely mass that you can work with. The secret now is just to try and mix the drier parts with the wetter parts. And that's not so hard. This is actually the perfect consistency. So I'll just do that, just work it a little bit. You can also leave your clay on the bat overnight, but then just remember to cover it with some plastic, because the very last thing you want after having worked so hard to smash up your dry clay and soak it in water is that it must become too hard to work with again. So you just want it so that you can manipulate it, that you can wedge it. That's it. Oopsie. This is interesting. A little piece of sponge. Definitely don't want that in my clay. Away you go into the dustbin. Ugh. Good. Is there some more? I hope not. Okay. Okay, now that the clay is coming together so wonderfully, I'm going to just wedge it, give it a good wedge. So I've broken this big ball of clay up into 4 smaller ones that I can wedge with ease. It's physically very exerting to wedge a ball of clay that's as big as this one was. So I'll just start with one of them and get wedging. And one should really take one's time wedging the clay well. It's essential for the quality of clay that you're going to have at the end of it. If you don't do this well, then you've actually wasted your time reworking your clay. because your projects won't be successful. And even having done this, I would again wedge the clay when I take it out of the bucket to work with, just to be on the safe side. Apart from lumps, something else that you definitely don't want in your reworked clay is air bubbles. So in order to get rid of the air bubbles, we smack the clay down as hard as we can on any solid surface. And you can really put some muscle behind that. Something else that you can do is to slap your clay. That brings the air bubbles to the surface, makes them pop, and it's very therapeutic. So that's something that you can do in addition to wedging. What I usually do is to count when I wedge, just to make sure that I don't get tired and start to slack. So for instance, for each of these 4 balls of clay, I would wedge, say, 150 or 200 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and so on, until I get to whatever figure I decided on. So I use this kind of wedging. It's referred to as the bull's head wedging because it sort of results in a shape that looks a little bit like a bull's head. So that's this batch done. Unfortunately for me, you'll remember that I still had some clay left in the bucket. So that's still waiting for me over here. Still a couple of 100 wedges to go. Okay, it's all done now and I'm exhausted. So that's what goes into reworking one small bucket of clay. So that's a wrap for our video on reworking clay. 3 methods. The first, soaking a big ball of clay in a bag full of water, submerged into water in another container. The second way is to smash up clay into small pieces and to add that to water in a bucket, and then to rework it on a plaster of Paris slab. And the last one, for clay that's not quite hard yet, to form it into a ball and to slice and spray until you have workable clay again. I hope you found this useful. If you have, please click like, and if you would like to have more clay dates with me in the studio, please subscribe.